Today I'm going to be talking to you about how to shade your 1-point perspective drawing. You can see that I have already drawn out all of my shapes. I included 12. You needed to include 8 to 10, but it's up to you if you want to draw more. I drew my 3 initials for Emma Kyle Florek, and I've also included 2 objects about myself. I'm going to turn this into a recipe book because I love cooking, and a paintbrush obviously because I love art. So everything's been outlined. I used my measurements tools, and you can see that I've also erased the horizon line. We don't need that anymore. At this point, I'm ready to start using my colored pencils. So it does not matter what brand of colored pencils you're using. I'm using Prismacolor pencils, which are a little bit more expensive and the colors are a little bit more vibrant. But before we start shading, it's important to talk about some vocabulary. So what we're gonna basically be doing is adding value to our drawing, which means shading, okay? So value is a fancy word in the art world for shading. This sphere has value to it because I've shaded it. And there are some important vocabulary terms that I have labeled on this picture, okay? So the first one is a light source. The light source is basically any sort of source of light. So that could be a flashlight, it could be a ceiling light, a lamp, the sun. Anything that produces light is a light source. A light source will always create a highlight on an object. That's a shiny part of an object. And it will also create a shadow and a cast shadow. So a form shadow is basically the shadow that's on the object itself, and a cast shadow is underneath the object, okay? I usually think of fishing, and if you're casting a line out into the water, it means you're throwing it out into the water. Same thing with a cast shadow, it's being thrown out underneath the object, okay? So the big terms that we need to know for this are value, shading, our light source, which is basically any source of light, and highlights, shadows, and cast shadows. So now we are ready to start shading. I am going to pretend that I am shining a flashlight directly onto my shape. So as they go further back towards the vanishing point, they're gonna get darker in value or darker in shading. So I'm gonna start with my blue, and I think I'm gonna start on this circle. So I'm turning my paper a little bit. And what I'm trying to do is I'm putting pressure down on my paper. And that's really all shading is different levels of pressure on your paper. It's okay if you go outside the lines a tiny bit like I did, because we're gonna end up outlining this in a black marker or black Sharpie. So I'm going to press down, and then you can see that I'm starting to lighten my pressure a little bit. And on the sides of my 1-point perspective drawing, I am going to add a little bit more value. I'm kind of putting medium pressure down. Now, my students usually get very frustrated when they see these lines. These lines were created when I originally started my drawing, and basically the only way that I can fix those is by holding my pencil up and down, apply a little bit of pressure, and you're basically filling in the groove that you created. So I'm gonna lightly layer some more colored pencil. Now, the middle of my shape right here, the part that's actually sticking out is gonna be the one that's closest to our light source, okay? So I'm gonna actually shade this part very lightly, but I'm trying to do it evenly. What you don't wanna do is you do not wanna submit a project that looks like this. This does not have good craftsmanship. It doesn't look neat. It doesn't look like it was done carefully. It looks like it's rushed and incomplete, so that would lose you points on your project. So you really wanna make sure that you are shading evenly. And this takes a little bit of time, but I actually find it kind of relaxing. So I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna shade. If shading your project takes you 10 minutes or less, I would tell you that it's probably not shaded well enough. So make sure that you're spending enough time on it. So I'm really going in, evening out my shading, trying to make sure that there's no scribble marks. And then just to be sure, I can go back over that again. Now, I can also take, if I wanted to, I could take like a darker blue, and this looks really beautiful once you start layering these. You can take the darker version of the color if you have a big set of colored pencils, and you see how that adds even more value, more shading. It makes it look even more 3D. I'm not shading too much in the middle because I don't want it to look, too blended or too even. So eventually what we're going to do, and I'm going to show you what this effect does, we're going to outline our piece, and you can see I'm going really slow. But outlining really helps make your shading pop. Okay, so you see how that really makes it look more 3D? So now I'm going to start shading my heart, okay? The thing is though, with the heart is behind my circle, right? And it's behind my E, which means that the E and the circle are probably creating a shadow or a cast shadow, okay, onto my heart. So I'm really gonna go in there and apply a lot of pressure right here. And then I'm gonna start to kind of even it out, blend it. And if you see that there's like a big jump from like where you've blended, so you can see right here it's really dark and then I've gone really light, all you need to do is apply medium pressure and just keep layering your pencil. Do you guys notice too how I'm kind of moving my pencil in a circular or like oval shape motion? I am not going back and forth necessarily. That's a technique called scumbling. I'll write that down. And that's a technique that allows me to really shade evenly. So on my lightest part of my heart, which is facing the light source, I'm going to lightly shade, make this really even. No scribble marks. Maybe a little more shading down here. And then I definitely want a lot of shading in here because it's not facing my light source. And again, the way that we're gonna make this pop is by adding our Sharpie marker line. And you can use any sort of black marker that you have on hand. I also recommend, it is really helpful if you start using measurements tools to do this. My hand is steady enough where I can handle outlining this, but you can see that it makes a huge difference in the shading. So now I've got to pay attention as I'm shading in the rest of my shapes, which shapes are overlapping. So if I start shading this one, this will be my last one that I'm demonstrating. This is going to be probably really dark because this guy is on top of this one, probably creating a pretty big shadow underneath. And then remember, I can always use kind of the darker version of a color or the color next to it on the color wheel even to shade it a little deeper. So I'm gonna take, I have like a darker orange. It looks red, but it's actually a darker orange. That makes a big difference. Can shade this a little bit. And then I'm ready to start outlining. All right, so you are going to start shading all of your shapes. You're gonna think about your light source, your shadows, your cast shadows, and remember, try to make sure that you're evening your shading out because a scribbled project is not a good project. This is also, before I forget, finished version. So you can see that I've really paid attention to my shadows, and I've also added some layers of colors. I've really tried to make things look 3D. I've shaded evenly, and I've taken my time.